This is my update for Russian military operations for June 24th, 2022. And as I always do for these updates, let's take a look at the map. This is liveuamap.com, very pro-Ukrainian. Basically, Ukrainian government and general staff briefings visualized. And just to give you an idea of how biased this map is, everything in red is held by Russia, and they're even counting Russian Crimea as occupied by Russia. A little bit ridiculous. But that's just to give you an idea of who's making this map. And I use a pro-Ukrainian map because I want to show you that even pro-Ukrainian sources are depicting a very less than ideal situation for Ukraine. It contradicts what the Western media is still trying to convince the public of, that somehow Ukraine has some sort of chance of doing something, anything. So let's start in southern Ukraine, Kherson City. This was taken over by Russia very early on in the conflict, and they've been consolidating political and economic control over the city and surrounding areas ever since. They've also been shaping the battlefield in the direction of Mykolaiv, Odessa, and Transnistria. Beyond that, they would like to complete the land bridge all the way to Transnistria. I truly believe that. But that's not going to happen now. The primary objective is the Donbas region. In the meantime, you're going to see things like this. This is a car bombing, killing who they're calling a collaborator. But really what it is it's locals working with the Russians to get their lives back to normal after 8 years of chaos under the US installed client regime. And the reason Ukraine is doing this is because they want to depict Russian-held territory as contested, that the people are rising up against Russian forces rather than working with them. They carry out these terrorist attacks specifically because the local population is working with Russia. So they carry out these terrorist attacks. It's a shortcut to making it look like things are much worse for Russia than they are. So let's go back to the map and let's move to the east. I just want to point this out. Donetsk city, it's a civilian populated area. It has very little military value. Ukraine is hammering Donetsk city. And the reason they're doing that is because the main fighting is happening up here in northern Donbas, around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. That is going very badly for Ukraine. And so they're trying to divert Russia's forces away from there and toward Donetsk city. I mean, to divide Russian forces to try to give Ukraine a better chance. And it didn't work. Russia has remained laser focused up in northern Donbas, and they will deal with these Ukrainian forces down here outside Donetsk city soon enough. Now let's take a look at Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. You can see a lot has changed here since my last update. As a matter of fact, it looks something like this. This was a couple of days ago, and you can see how much bigger this cauldron was, and you could see how Russian forces closed this off and took over all of this. They either captured, killed, or drove out all of the Ukrainian forces in this pocket. There were somewhere around 2,000. That is the number that I kept seeing both sides citing, and now it looks like this. And even this pro-Ukrainian map are saying that Ukrainians are withdrawing from Severodonetsk. They only held this industrial area in the first place. They are now admitting that they are trying to withdraw completely from Severodonetsk. And they might want to think about leaving entirely from Lysychansk as well, because the trend here is from south to north, closing off this entire area and everyone inside it. And then the next battle will be around Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and the battlefield has been shaped around Slavyansk all of this time. Russian forces have been creeping closer and closer to Slavyansk, and they're just waiting for this to wrap up. Now, imagine if this cauldron was completely closed off. This line would be straightened out. So all of these Russian forces in and around here and layered, they would be able to straighten their line out across here, outside of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And that would be a greater concentration of Russian forces against Ukrainian forces than currently because of this cauldron. So it's a complete disaster for Ukraine, but of course the Western media, certain segments of the Western media, they're going to try to depict it as otherwise. So let's take a look at the Institute for the Study of War. It's a Washington-based I guess you could call it a think tank. I would call it more of a war propaganda outfit. That seems to be what they mainly focus on. But let's see what they have to say about this. Russian forces have made substantial gains in the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk area over the last several days, and Ukrainian troops continue to suffer high casualties. But Ukrainian forces have fundamentally accomplished their objective in the battle by slowing down and degrading Russian forces. But at the same time, they're degrading their own forces at a much higher rate. So what did they actually accomplish? Nothing. This is just ISW trying to spin it. However, the loss of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk will not represent a major turning point in the war. Isn't that convenient for Ukraine? Ukrainian troops have succeeded for weeks in drawing substantial quantities of Russian personnel, weapons, and equipment into the area and have likely degraded Russian forces' overall capabilities while preventing Russian forces from focusing on more advantageous axes of advance. What more advantageous axes of advance? They never say. And at the same time, they're drawing in substantial quantities of Russian forces. The Ukrainians have been sending substantial numbers of troops to Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. They've been drawing Ukrainian forces from across the entire country. They were drawing forces from outside of Kharkov to the point where defenses weakened enough for Russia to take back more territory outside of Kharkov. So again, if you actually look at what's going on in Ukraine, okay, you slowed down Russian forces. You attracted a large concentration of Russian forces around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, but you also lost huge numbers of your own troops, huge amounts of equipment. You drew in your own forces from across the country, and on top of that, you lost men at a much higher rate than Russia did. So how's that some sort of success? It isn't. It isn't. ISW also says Russian offensive operations will likely stall in the coming weeks. And they never explain why that is, why they think that. Whether or not Russian forces capture the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk area, likely granting Ukrainian forces the opportunity to launch prudent counteroffensives. Launching prudent counteroffensives with what forces? As I just pointed out, as Ukraine admitted themselves, they are losing troops at a much higher rate than Russia is. So who are they going to be, scraping together to carry out these prudent counteroffensives against Russian forces that have not actually degraded to the degree Ukrainian forces have? It also says the Kremlin's ideological fixation on the capture of Severodonetsk, much like the earlier siege of Azovstal, will likely be to the ultimate detriment of Russian capabilities and future advances in Ukraine. The loss of Severodonetsk is a loss for Ukraine in the sense that any terrain captured by Russian forces is a loss, but the Battle of Severodonetsk will not be a decisive Russian victory. I think it will be, because Russia's whole point of being in Ukraine in the first place is to secure the Donbas region, and taking Severodonetsk and Lysychansk is a major part of doing that. Now, this idea that the Kremlin is ideologically fixated on the capture of Severodonetsk, that is just projection. That is actually Ukraine. Ukraine is fixated on holding Severodonetsk. They drew forces from all across Ukraine to try to do so. They have failed, and it's cost them dearly. The idea of comparing this to Azovstal is ridiculous. What happened with Azovstal? They're talking about Mariupol. By mid to late April, Russia had all of Mariupol under its control. The remnants of Ukrainian forces were hiding underground in the Azovstal steelworks in what was essentially a self-imposed subterranean prison camp, and they stayed there until they ran out of food and water, and they begged the Russians to send them to a proper prison camp where they all are right now. ISW and many others in the Western media and Ukrainian media and government, they have always tried to say that those brave, valiant Ukrainian forces pinned down huge numbers of Russian forces in Mariupol, preventing them from advancing elsewhere on the battlefield. Completely untrue. The Pentagon itself admitted that there were about 2,000 Russian forces in Mariupol. After the city was secured, the vast majority of the forces involved in taking Mariupol redeployed elsewhere, including all across the Donbas region, leading to these victories that Russia is enjoying right now. Ukrainian forces in the Azovstal steelworks numbered over 2,500, meaning that there were more Ukrainians hiding underground than Russian forces above ground waiting for them. That was how actually calamitous the defeat of Ukraine in Mariupol was. And that's basically what's going on around Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and these other areas that Russia has cleared out now of Ukrainian forces. ISW, they're doing war propaganda. They're trying to spin a catastrophic Ukrainian defeat into something less than what it actually is. And just to drive this point home, I just want to point out what ISW was saying about Kharkov. They said the Ukrainian General Staff stated that Russian forces are trying to prevent Ukrainian forces in northern Kharkiv Oblast from threatening the rear of Russian operations heading towards Slavyansk. Russian forces conducted artillery strikes on Kharkiv city and settlements to the north and southeast. Now, this battle outside Kharkov, if you could even call it a battle, I mean, the Russian forces outside Kharkov are conducting fixing operations. They just want to hold Ukrainian forces there in place so that they don't reinforce Ukrainian positions in the Donbas region. Well, that's what it looks like they did anyway. Despite Russian troops being outside Kharkov, Ukraine started siphoning forces from there and sending them to Severodonetsk. That is what allowed Russian forces to make the advances that they have in the last week or two outside Kharkov. The fact that they were taking troops from all across Ukraine to try to hold onto Severodonetsk, and then now they have failed. That's just to give you an idea of just how badly this has gone for Ukraine. Russia's rear is not in any danger from the forces outside Kharkov, the Ukrainian forces outside of Kharkov. That is not threatening their logistics into the Donbas region. ISW, others are trying to claim that Ukraine they're not trying to hold Severodonetsk. They were just buying time. Buying time to do what? They'll say to wait until all of these heavy weapons from the West arrive. So let's talk about the Western arms shipments to Ukraine. The HIMARS, 4 of these HIMARS vehicles are supposedly already in the hands of Ukrainian forces and being used on the battlefield right now. If you missed it, it's because, look, it's not going to make any difference. It's not going to make any difference. So let's take a look at this article from the Associated Press via Defense News. U.S. to send Ukraine rocket systems, other aid in new package. Let's read a little bit from this article. The U.S. will send another $450 million in military aid to Ukraine, including some additional medium-range rocket systems, U.S. officials said Thursday. The latest package will include a number of high-mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS, and is expected to be announced later Thursday. The initial 4 HIMARS that the U.S. sent have already gone into Ukraine and are in the hands of troops there. The package will also include ammunition and other supplies. So that will be 4 HIMARS already on the battlefield, plus however many more they're about to send. What do we wait for? We wait and see how long it takes Russia to find and destroy these 4 HIMARS, and then we see if this next shipment even covers the losses that Ukraine is going to suffer in the meantime. And no matter what happens, whether these original 4 HIMARS are able to link up with however many more they send, we have to understand that these rocket systems that the West is sending, HIMARS, M270s, they're going to be facing hundreds of Russian multiple launch rocket systems. A lot of them have similar capabilities to the HIMARS and the M270s. There's Iskander missile systems on the battlefield. They have an even longer range than the HIMARS and the M270s have. You also have the entirety of Russia's military aviation, warplanes, helicopter gunships, and of course all of these cruise missiles that Russia has, land-based, sea-based, air-launched. They have many options open to them to fighting back against this small handful of multiple launch rocket systems that the US and its allies are sending Ukraine. So it's really just a matter of us sitting back and waiting to see, first of all, where Ukraine deploys these systems and how long it takes Russia to target and destroy them. Drones. Let's take a look at drones. This is from Foreign Policy Magazine. It's not Afghanistan. Ukrainian pilots push back on US-provided drones. Now, I've talked about the Bayraktar TB2s sent to Ukraine by Turkey, And, you know, in the beginning, everyone was celebrating the Bayraktar TB2. They had this footage of, you know, 2 or 3 Russian vehicles being destroyed by TB2s. That was because at that time, Russia had their forces spread out across all of Ukraine. And they didn't, you know, they had a lot of forces operating out from under the cover of Russian air defense systems. Once that phase of the operation was over and they consolidated their forces in southern and eastern Ukraine, that stopped. They had all of their forces under the cover of Russian air defenses, and all these TB2s started getting shot down when they got too close. And the number of targets available to them became fewer and fewer. They've lost many, many of these TB2s. And when the US said they were going to send these Gray Eagle drones, I explained how they're basically the same specifications. The Gray Eagle can carry like a little bit of a heavier payload, maybe stay in the air a little bit longer, but more or less they're comparable to the TB2s. And I said that they're not going to fare very well against Russian air defenses. And so that's exactly what this foreign policy article is saying. So what do they say? They say Ukrainian military officials are enmeshed in a hotly contested debate over whether US provided Gray Eagle strike drones can be effective against increasingly resilient Russian air defenses, while the Biden administration considers providing Kiev with the systems that became ubiquitous in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Foreign policy also says both Ukrainian and American officials are increasingly concerned that Gray Eagles could be shot down by advanced Russian air defense systems. The attack drones are armed with Hellfire missiles that can hit targets only up to about 5 miles away, far less than the one-way kamikaze drones that the United States has provided to Ukraine. We never hear about those drones. We never see any evidence of them accomplishing anything on the battlefield. So I don't know what happens with them. And this foreign policy article doesn't go into any details on that either. In just the past several weeks, Russia has beefed up air defenses on the border and inside Ukraine, said Samuel Bendet, an advisor with the CNA think tank. Their systems are working on a more massive scale, he said. Their early warning radars are working. Their air defenses are working. So losing Gray Eagles is a real possibility to such a layered defense. Now, there's another article, also from the Western media. This is from War on the Rocks, very pro-Ukrainian, very pro-NATO, getting drones ready for conventional war. And they're saying that because what has the US been using their drones for all along? Killing people in developing countries with no air force, no air defenses to speak of. That's what they've been using their drones for. Taking that weapon platform and throwing it into an environment with layered air defenses means your drone's being shot down. That's what happened to the TB2s from Turkey. That's what will happen to any of these US drones the US wants to send to Ukraine. So War on the Rocks, this article is by Joe Ritter. He was a US Air Force officer and he had experience flying US drones in combat. And what does he say? He says, while the US military fields an impressive arsenal of unmanned aircraft, the effectiveness of these drones is largely unproven in roles beyond counterterrorism. In Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere across the Middle East, drones like the MQ-1 Predator and MQ-9 Reaper provided the United States and its allies with a decisive intelligence and precision strike capability, often finding and killing high-value enemy leaders that would have been otherwise impossible to target. But, he admits, while the United States and its allies have significant experience employing drones in counterterrorism, they have perilously little experience against advanced threats. The only way to develop this experience is through integrated multi-domain training. Exercises like Red Flag were designed to prepare manned air crews for combat, yet unmanned aircraft participation in such events is very limited due to their level of operational commitment. Restrictions on the use of unmanned aircraft operations within the U.S. national airspace system further limits training opportunities. So the bottom line here is it's not just the technical limitations of these drones, which there are many. They cannot penetrate layered Russian air defense systems. They all admit that. And it's been demonstrated in Ukraine with these Turkish TB2s. They're also saying that even in U.S. hands, the U.S. drone operators, they have not trained to operate these in an environment with layered air defense systems. They lack the technical capability to do this. They also lack the tactical and strategic training necessary to do this, if it was even possible. All of this that I just talked about in regards to drones applies to conventional Western manned aircraft systems. So now, wait until you see this one. This is from the office of U.S. Congressman Adam Kinzinger. It's a press release, Ukraine Fighter Pilots Act. Okay, this is relatively recent. Listen to this. Today, U.S. Air Force veterans Congressman Adam Kinzinger and Congresswoman Chrissy Holohan introduced legislation to train Ukrainian fighter pilots and crews on U.S. military air assets. The bill would allow the United States to begin training Ukrainian pilots and aircrew members on F-15s, F-16s, and other air platforms while the administration continues to consider sending such equipment. The representatives remain hopeful that there won't be a need for further escalation, but they both agree that it's critical for the Ukrainian military to be trained and familiar with these air platforms should Russia continue their malign campaign against Ukraine's sovereignty. Regardless of whether the United States and its allies deploy such equipment, this program will strengthen the Ukrainian military and ensure their long-term stability and security. It also says, having both served in the United States Air Force, Representatives Kinzinger and Holohan recognize the importance of establishing aerial combat supremacy. Given that public reporting suggests neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians have established air superiority thus far, the United States can help Ukraine change the situation in the air domain, giving Ukrainian forces a decisive advantage in the war. No, they cannot. Let me explain why none of this makes any sense. First of all, Russia does have air superiority, localized, say, in the Donbas region, for example. Maybe not over all of Ukraine, but over the Donbas region, yes. And as they expand the amount of Ukrainian territory that they hold and they move their layered air defenses forward, the area in which they have air supremacy or air dominance over is going to grow. It's not just about the aircraft, it's also about their respective air defense systems. Russia, as I have said many, many times, has the best air defense systems in the world. This is according to CSIS, Missile Defense Project. CSIS is a US government and arms manufacturer funded think tank. Russian air and missile defense. What do they say about Russian air defenses? They say during the Cold War, the Soviet Union invested heavily in its air defense systems. As a result, Russia now possesses some of the most advanced air and missile defense systems in the world. Current Russian air defense doctrine follows a three-tier approach. This layered system allows Russian air defense forces to create anti-access area denial zones that can be difficult to penetrate. On February 24, 2022, Ukraine had an air force. They had an air force and they had TB2 drones from Turkey. They had all of this. Ukrainian aircraft couldn't penetrate Russia's layered air defenses. Their Turkish-built Bayraktar TB2 drones could not. We just saw the US admit that their Gray Eagle drones won't be able to. And neither can US F-16 or F-15 fighter aircraft. They cannot. They cannot, they will not. There's only one possible outcome for the US sending F-16s, F-15s, any other system like that to Ukraine. Most of them are going to be destroyed before they even leave the ground. I mean, that's what happened to most of Ukraine's Air Force from February 24th onward. They were destroyed before they even left the ground. Others were on missions. They got destroyed by Russian air defense systems or Russia's Air Force. They have their own Air Force. That is what's going to happen to any aircraft the West sends Ukraine. You send them F-16s, F-15s, they're not invulnerable to Russian air defense systems. They will be shot down just like all of Ukraine's other warplanes were. I want to point this out one more time. I want it to be very, very clear. At the beginning of this conflict, Ukraine had everything. They had an air force, they had artillery, they had their own rocket launchers, they had everything. And it's all been destroyed by Russia. And the US and its Western allies, they do not have systems with capabilities that greatly surpass anything Ukraine started this conflict out with. And they don't have it in the quantities necessary to even replace what Ukraine had at the very beginning of this conflict. Which brings me to the next area of focus. I want to talk about military-industrial bases. Russia versus the West. Now, Alexander Mercurius from the Duran, he did a really good video on this. And the link to that video will be in the video description below. I highly recommend people tune in and listen to it. It's about a Royal United Services Institute article titled "The Return of Industrial Warfare." Let me put it up on the screen here real quick. Right here. So Russia, the return of industrial warfare. These are all these articles on Russia are by people who have been in the military, U.S. military. Alexander does a really good job breaking down this article in detail. I just want to point out a couple of the main points that jumped out at me. The mass-scale combat has pitted 250,000 Ukrainian soldiers together with 450,000 recently mobilized citizen soldiers against about 200,000 Russian and separatist troops. The effort to arm, feed, and supply these armies is a monumental task. Ammunition resupply is particularly onerous. For Ukraine, compounding this task are Russian deep fire capabilities, which target Ukrainian military industry and transportation networks throughout the depth of the country. The Russian army has also suffered from Ukrainian cross-border attacks and acts of sabotage, but at a smaller scale, I will say a much, much smaller scale. The rate of ammunition and equipment consumption in Ukraine can only be sustained by a large-scale industrial base. And what they're basically saying is that the large-scale industrial base has to be somewhere else other than Ukraine, because Ukraine's industrial base has been destroyed. Even the presidential advisor, Alexei Arestovich, he said that this was weeks, if not months ago. He said that Ukraine's military-industrial capacity has been completely destroyed by Russia, and I don't doubt that. This Russia article goes over some of the numbers. They talk about artillery rounds per day used by Russia, over 7,000 artillery rounds, and they're talking about the annual U.S. purchases of artillery rounds are so few that at this rate, 7,000 artillery rounds a day, the U.S. would, their annual supply would last about 10 days to about 3 weeks, depending on how accurate that number 7,000 is. The article also talks about limitations for the production of anti-aircraft missiles and anti-tank missiles, and I've talked about this in the past. The Stinger and the Javelin missile systems, what the US has sent to Ukraine, it's going to take them now years to replace, and they really don't have that many more to send to Ukraine. And we can see that it really made no major difference on the battlefield. Russia is still winning. They still have plenty of tanks on the battlefield. The article also talks about cruise missiles, and they're pointing out that Russia has been firing these cruise missiles at a pretty high rate. They have been sustaining it, and judging by metrics like how many people the companies building these cruise missiles have hired, their operating costs and everything, that they probably can sustain this rate more or less indefinitely. What's going on here? What's going on here is that Russia prepared for this specific war, knowing full well that it would be intense, sustained combat operations, that they would require huge numbers of bullets, artillery rounds, rockets, cruise missiles, everything from dumb bombs to precision-guided munitions, and they created the industrial capacity to produce them and to sustain production in a battle like this. And the West has not. They have not. The West's military, again, has been configured around attacking and destroying developing nations that lack standing armies, air defenses, air forces, navies. They've created a small wars industrial base. And even sometimes they would run out of bullets and they would run into limitations because their industrial capacity is not big enough. And you would say that's crazy because the military industrial complex in the West is enormous. Yes, in terms of profits, it's enormous. That's the key to understand here. In terms of profits, it is enormous. It's because they are making so much profit. It comes at the cost of actual quantities. And some might even say quality. And that's the real problem. Russia has slimmed down its military industrial complex to produce huge amounts. I don't think that their main goal is profits. The main goal is to make enough to win a war. The West has been just making tons of money. That is the main goal of their arms industry, making tons of money. Listening to an expert from RUSI talk about how mismatched the industrial bases are between Russia and the West. If the West wants to prevail against peer and near-peer competitors like Russia and China, they're going to need to reconfigure their entire industrial base. And that will take years to do, even if they are completely 100% determined to do it. It will still take years to do it. I don't think Ukraine's got years to do it. But listening to one RUSI expert admit that, and then you have this one. Russia's Ukraine invasion, the most dangerous phase is upon us. This is by Alexander Danilyak. He's a special advisor to the head of Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service. And what does he say? The Russian war in Ukraine is entering its third stage and is finally becoming a war of attrition. This requires readiness not only on the part of Ukraine, but also its international partners. The short initial race is over, and now the winner will be the one who has not only the will to win, but also enough resources to continue to maintain the current dynamics of the confrontation. It is obvious that despite international sanctions, the Russian economy is in a much better condition than the destroyed Ukrainian economy. Wars of attrition are won by the rear, and the only rear left in Ukraine is the international coalition in support of Ukraine, which was formed in April 2022 in Ramstein, Germany. And they're talking about this like Friends of Ukraine coalition where all these countries get together and they pool their resources, arms, and money, and they just dump it into Ukraine to wage this proxy war against Russia. Danilyak goes from talking about the opening phases of Russia's military operations, trying to shock Ukraine into surrendering by rushing at all of the major population centers. Now they've shifted to this more long-term strategy of using long-range fires, especially in the Donbas region, incrementally taking and holding territory. And he says, although many expected Putin to declare a total war on 9 May and begin a general mobilization, the Russian leadership focused on depleting Ukraine, taking full advantage of its military, economic, and energy advantages. This was immediately apparent from the changing behavior of Russian troops on the line of contact, where they increasingly used massive artillery fire, taking advantage of both the number of long-range systems at their disposal and the lack of any need to save ammunition. It is clear that in the conditions of a protracted war and a continuing naval blockade, the economy of Ukraine, which has been destroyed by the war, will have minimum chances of recovery. The ongoing fuel crisis in Ukraine is likely to be exacerbated by a gas crisis as winter closes in. Financial and budgetary crisis may leave the Ukrainian government without the ability to pay salaries and pensions and create the preconditions for social destabilization. Ukraine's only hope for victory in the protracted conflict with Russia is strong support from the international coalition. We just heard a RUSI expert admitting that the West lacks the industrial capacity to compete with Russia in this type of conflict. We can see what Ukraine actually needs to win this war. If they were to win this war, they would need hundreds of multiple launch rocket systems. They would need a whole new air force. They would need thousands of artillery pieces, hundreds, if not over 1,000 tanks, thousands of armored vehicles. They would need all of this. Then they would need training for tens of thousands of personnel to use it all, use all of this equipment, because we're not talking about just matching a number of men you recruited with an amount of equipment you acquired, putting it together and throwing it onto the battlefield. You actually have to train them, and it goes beyond training entry-level operators for this equipment. You also need non-commissioned officers, sergeants and above, and officers for the Ukrainian military to function in a coordinated and effective manner on the battlefield. And that can take years to do, because the best troops Ukraine had, they're all being destroyed in the Donbas region right now. Part of clinging to Severodonetsk, you know, this ideological fixation that Kiev and its sponsors had on Severodonetsk, holding it for whatever reason, that has cost them their best troops. They're not going to be able to replace them, save for years of training. So this is what Ukraine is up against right now. And just as Alexander Danylyuk, just as he said, Russia hasn't even fully mobilized yet for this war. What if they decide to do that? Think about that. Also think about the fact that all of the pipelines Russia's military has for producing a variety of trained personnel, including those for leadership positions and roles on the battlefield, those pipelines are still operating. They have not invested their whole military into this conflict. And their rear in Russia, across all of Russia, is safe, far away from the fighting in Ukraine. This is what Ukraine is up against. You could see how hopeless it is. So maybe that's why the West is focusing instead, because they cannot solve this problem, they're focusing instead on these empty political gestures. Let's take a look at one of those empty political gestures. Look at this headline from Al Jazeera. As Kiev claims political victory, Russia advances in East Ukraine. While Ukraine moves closer to the EU and away from Moscow's orbit, Russian troops seize further territory in the Donbas. The article says, in the 17th week of Russia's war on Ukraine, Kiev is poised to become a candidate for the European Union, signaling another step away from Russia's sphere of influence. But it also says, meanwhile, Russia is pressing for battlefield victories that would dampen these Western political triumphs. A political triumph doesn't cost anything. It also doesn't really mean anything. That's why the West is doing it, because it's something easy that they can do versus all of these technical challenges they have on the battlefield. They cannot overcome them, so they say, okay, let's have Ukraine become a candidate for EU membership. But what does that actually ultimately mean if Russia is still carving off Ukrainian territory? What's even going to be left of Ukraine when it becomes an EU member? And then when it becomes an EU member, so what? The whole point of Russia going into Ukraine was to eliminate it as a threat to Russia and to the Russian-speaking Ukrainians that were tormented by the client regime in Kiev from 2014 onward. They're accomplishing that. Whatever is left of Ukraine that actually enters into the EU, if it enters into the EU, is not going to be a threat anymore to Russia. Enough of Ukraine is going to be taken and rolled into either the Russian Federation itself or the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, that what's left of Ukraine, it will not be a threat. And then one more article, just to kind of give you an idea of how things are unraveling for the West. This is also from Al Jazeera. Why are some nations neutral on the Russia-Ukraine war? And when they say that, it's not why are some nations. It's really why are most nations. If Africa, Asia, if entire regions of the planet don't care about the US and the EU and their proxy war against Russia. And by that I mean, it's not that they're not concerned about the conflict. I think that they are concerned about the conflict. They're just not seeing it the West's way. This article says it pretty well. It says, India's balancing act of appeasing both Russia and the West has caught the EU off guard. But in New Delhi in April, van der Leyen reiterated the dangers of the war in Ukraine at a press conference. The outcome of Russian President Vladimir Putin's war will not only determine the future of Europe, but also deeply affect the Indo-Pacific region and the rest of the world. For the Indo-Pacific, it is important, as for Europe, that borders are respected and that spheres of influence are rejected. We want a positive vision for a peaceful and prosperous Indo-Pacific, she told reporters. This is a European leader talking about the way things should be in the Indo-Pacific, while at the same time saying there should be no spheres of influence. It's ridiculous. I think the Indo-Pacific region, I think the continent of Africa, the nations that constitute the continent of Africa, I think they can see and hear the hypocrisy. I think they understand what this is really about. I think they're biding their time for multipolarism to take shape and to replace this unipolar world order that created this whole problem in the first place. So we'll keep an eye on this. We'll keep an eye on what's going on the battlefield in Ukraine, but also the larger geopolitical context developing around it. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. You can do that on Telegram and also Odyssey and Rumble. All of my videos are backed up automatically on those two platforms, just in case YouTube deletes my channel. Also in the video description below, you will find all of the references that I used while making this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. You can do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and also through PayPal. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's month-to-month memberships, one-time donations, or even if you're just helping share my work with others, I greatly appreciate that. I could not do this work without that support, so thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.